Welcome to Chapter and Verse for part 2 of a two-part presentation on domestic violence, specifically violence against young girls and women aged 11 to 19 and 19 to 24. We're talking with a couple of wonderful representatives from the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence. Would you introduce yourselves?
My name is Neyda DeJesus, and I am the Director of Prevention at the Women's Resource Center.
My name is Krista, and I am the Director of Prevention at the Rhode Island Coalition Against Domestic Violence.
We were talking last week about the prevalence of domestic violence directed against young people. And my question was, how prevalent is it? How prevalent is it?
So sadly, it is very prevalent in our state. Dating violence is a really serious issue. It's negatively impacting the lives of young people in our communities. And we know through what's called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, happens every other year. The survey runs. And from data from that survey, most recent is from 2019. We learned that over 1 in 7 young people report experiencing dating violence. Mm-hmm. And that is defined in the survey as someone forces you to do something sexual that you don't want to do or physically hurts you on purpose. So physical and sexual dating violence. It doesn't even account for emotional, verbal, psychological abuse, even digital, technology abuse. So that's a really high number. And the number doesn't even tell the whole story of how severe and widespread this violence is.
It doesn't even tell the whole story because it doesn't report all the areas.
Yes, this survey is a random sampling of schools in Rhode Island. And as we were talking about earlier, young people might not even know that what they're experiencing is considered dating violence. So they may not report yes because they don't know yet that that's something that is actually dating violence, or may not feel comfortable reporting it.
And while we were talking off camera, we were talking about how people mistake violence for love. What an interesting idea that is. Let's unpack that. How does that happen when somebody thinks they're loved by getting beaten up?
Well, I mean, again, sharing a personal example, growing up witnessing domestic violence, I learned at an early age that was love. Abusing and accepting abuse and being abused in any form of violence was love, was how you show love. And, later on I learned that wasn't how you show love. And if you're growing up in an environment that, you're either being physically abused yourself or you're witnessing abuse, you can easily learn that that's what love is, and that's how you should be loved. And it shouldn't be, you shouldn't accept that type of abuse in any way, and it is not love.
The American Psychological Association has reached a consensus, and it hasn't always been the case, but relatively recently, they've said that physical violence in terms of discipline is unacceptable and counterproductive. My son once said to me, and talking about the subject of discipline, in response to my bringing up the Bible says, if you spare the rod, you don't really love your child. And my son said to me, Daddy, that's crazy. He said, are you trying to teach people against violence by perpetrating violence? And I said, that seems to be part of the thing. It seems to be part of the dynamic of it. But I was in a discussion not too long ago involving the Bible. And the Bible does say, spare the rod and spoil the child. But somebody added to that just a couple of weeks ago in a further discussion, said that the rod that was being discussed was the rod that a shepherd carries for its sheep. It has a crook in it where they can bring the sheep closer by. And he said there's no example of a shepherd beating the sheep with the rod. It's just it's a big rod, and it's not, but maybe that's, I still have to hear more about this, but maybe that's what's being meant by spare the rod. I know it has to do with discipline, but discipline is the same word which Jesus used when he talked about disciples. The word discipline appears in the word disciple, and they were his students. So there's no record of him beating his students, and that's sort of interesting. That's being worked out. I was talking with somebody from the Rhode Island Psychological Association, and he's quite clear about that. I was going to try to bring him on the program with a pastor who's also a psychologist, and he said that he believes in discipline, physical, corporal discipline, in the home. And it turns, I did a little research, ABC television news, or ABC News, associated with the television and radio, said that about 70% of parents today use physical corporal punishment on their children. 70%, according to ABC.
It goes back to what we were talking about before filming, which was we don't spend a lot of time learning about and teaching young people healthy ways to solve conflict. So those parents grew up, and that was the norm, was to solve violence using violence or address violence using violence. I think you can have discipline, structure, expectations, responsibility, boundaries, all of those things without physical violence. And those actually, we need all of those things. That shows young people what healthy boundaries look like, what accountability looks like. We can do that with love, we can do that lovingly, but still have structure and expectations and accountability. But if we use physical violence to solve problems or address conflict, then the cycle will just continue.
That's what the representative for the Rhode Island Psychological Association said. He said that there's a perpetration through time of the same behavior. My son thinks it's crazy. He just said it's just crazy. He said, trying to. I don't really know about prisons. That's a subject, a different subject. But they're saying we should not imprison violent offenders because they don't do that in one of the Scandinavian countries, according to Michael Moore, the filmmaker. And he said we should just show them love. I'm not sure about that. I don't know. I mean, if there's a violent perpetrator in the community, I don't feel safe for the members of that community. And I don't think, I know we don't abuse the prisoners. I don't think that's happening, but I don't know if we should follow the advice of Alexandria Cortez and just close the prisons and let people out.
It's a very complex topic, but it's complex because sometimes survivors of domestic violence end up going to jail because of the abuse they're experiencing. Self-defense measures.
Yes.
People do experience violence when they are in prison, sometimes at the hands of even the people who are in power. So survivors have experienced domestic violence in the community, and then they experience violence in prison as well. And I think when we think about this, oftentimes we talk about that's responding to violence that's already happening. And that's one way that we have, one existing way. But what are other ways that the community can hold that person accountable and say, we're not going to tolerate this? Sometimes survivors don't want the person abusing them to go to jail because they're their children's father. They are the primary earner. That's how they have a home. That's why homelessness is such a leading, domestic violence is such a leading cause of homelessness, because someone has to choose between, do I stay in the violent situation or do I become homeless with myself and possibly my children. So it's very complex, but we do talk a lot about how do we as a community come together to address this violence and not only rely on systems, because we've had these systems in place for many years, but the rates of violence are not decreasing. So
Yes.
how do we decrease the violence? How do we get to the root cause of the violence? Because just using criminal justice measures isn't working to actually decrease the violence.
A policeman with whom I was talking once said that he would rather face a bank robber than go into a domestic abuse situation. Because he said only in a domestic abuse situation will the victim attack the policeman. And he said, this is crazy. Somebody tried to bite one of his fingers off because he tried to save her life. This is utter craziness. Well, but that kind of explains the connection, why people are so imbued with violence that they confuse that for love, because they're related to the perpetrator, the father of their child, and they don't want to break up the home, which is probably a worthy goal. I was any thoughts?
Yeah, just that violence isn't love, right? And they don't deserve that. No one does.
Yes.
And love could be a barrier. It often is. And the person believes the person can change. The person being victimized believes that they can change, loves them, wants to see them do better, wants them to be a member of the community, doesn't want them to go to prison. And I think that's really, we have to think about all of these nuances, because then some survivors say, no, I was not feeling love for this person who was causing me harm, but there were many other barriers. So everyone's situation is different. Some will say, I really was still in love, and that was one of my barriers. And some will say, nope, it wasn't love, it was fear. Or it was, I would have been homeless, or it was all of these other, so many barriers. And many people they ask, why didn't you just leave, right? We still hear that today. Why didn't the person just leave? It's really not that simple. There are so many barriers, and love can be one of them.
Right.
Before we leave the topic, give me some of the barriers to leaving.
So, as Krista alluded to, it could be financial, due to financial reasons. They may have children together, and they don't want to break up the family. There may not be a support system that could help them if they do decide to leave. There's also barriers where the individual may not even know how to go about even taking care of themselves, because the perpetrator has had control over everything. And that's yet another fear, that they're going to face the world with all this unknown and uncertainty. So those are some of the barriers I can think of.
Apparently firearms play a prominent role in the destructiveness within dating violence. Is there some kind of problem with the law? We got in Rhode Island, if a person shows a proclivity for violence, the person goes on a list, and he's not allowed to purchase firearms. I think that's part of the law. Is there another part of the law?
A few years ago, we passed the Protect Rhode Island Families Act, and that requires anyone convicted of domestic violence to relinquish firearms. So taking firearms out of the hands of abusive people. Because we know, I think it's, if a firearm's present in an abusive situation, the risk of homicide is 5 times greater. So it's a huge lethality risk factor, and we see that in Rhode Island.
This is true for even young people, aged 11 to 19. The firearms become a real locus of danger.
And I think we have to understand that it isn't because the person one day snaps or has a fit of anger. It really has been escalating, and that abuse has been escalating over time, and homicide is the final act of control, and that's how they wield control over that person. But the fact that there's a firearm present makes that action much faster, much easier to do, and much more deadly.
So there's a building up of behavior.
Right.
would you recommend that a victim blow the whistle right at the start? If the boyfriend turns out to be an abuser, a physical abuser, should the girl blow the whistle right then and there before it gets any worse?
I think it goes back to, that's usually not how abusive relationships start. So if that happened on your first date,
Yeah.
you'd probably say, okay, I'm not going to see this person anymore,
Right.
right? It happens very gradually over time. And by the time you realize I'm in a dangerous situation or an unhealthy situation, that's when all those barriers come into play. So it's already gotten to that point, and now you're faced with, it's not easy for the person to just leave. It's not easy for them to just say, oh, I see that this is abusive and now I can end the relationship. And actually ending the relationship is one of the most dangerous times because, again, the person's losing power and control over the victim. So
Yes.
it's not as easy as just leaving, and that can be one of the most dangerous times.
There was a famous case relatively recently regarding the murder of, I think her name was Gabby Petito, something like that. And the police were faulted because they came upon a situation where it was self-confessed abuse, and they didn't separate the couple, or they didn't separate them enough. So now the blame is shifted to some extent on the police and their methods. What do you think about that?
That's a tough one, right, to process and think about. I think, my experience with supporting survivors through my former role as the residential director. I overseen the emergency shelter and the transitional housing program. And I worked with a client, working with clients, you see a lot of things. You sort of kind of witness a lot of what survivors have gone through and some of the challenges they have along the way. And one of the things that was mentioned throughout my time there is that, like, whenever they involve their police, they are never believed. Because the
Is that right?
perpetrator, and I'm not saying this for all cases, but most cases, the perpetrator has manipulated the situation into making it almost sound like it's the victim's fault. And they're the abuser, or they're the ones that are misbehaving inappropriately or whatnot. So sometimes when those type of things happen in that moment, victims lose trust in that system.
Yes. How many cases are there of mutual abuse, knockdown, drag-out fights between the couple?
Well, domestic violence is defined as one person has the power and control.
Interesting.
And so that's why it does make it difficult, I think, sometimes for law enforcement or anyone who's around a situation, because they don't understand that that's the dynamic. So that doesn't mean that the victim may sometimes be retaliating, may sometimes exhibit unhealthy behaviors, right? They're in this toxic environment.
Yes.
So what are they doing to survive? But that's where a lot of the victim blaming attitudes come in. That person must have provoked them. They must have done something to deserve it, right? So that's where a lot of the education comes into play too, is when we're talking about domestic and dating violence, one person has that power and control. And so it is a very specific type of violence.
I wanted to mention something I mentioned last week, but there are some people who may not have seen last week's program. So I wanted to mention the Apostle Paul's statement related to, us, the hookup culture, the disposable culture, where people get discarded. Paul said that when we get bound together in a sexual union, he said there's something special about that because it unites the couple very closely. And one of the things about domestic violence, as it relates to young people aged 11 to 19, or 24 to or 19 to 24, has to do with jealousy. Jealousy plays a part a big part in the goings on in domestic violence. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
And it's also something that comes up in healthy relationships too, right? It's normal to feel jealous sometimes, right? That's different than that extreme jealousy, that thinking that you have the right to that person, that you own that person, that you can control that person, right? So I think that's why we try to have these conversations with young people too, is as an adult, of course I've felt jealous of my partner or of a situation, right? It's how do I deal with that? How do I have, skills and ways to deal with that? And it is distinct from an abusive situation where someone is showing such extreme jealousy because they believe they're entitled to that person.
Almost slavery. Kind of slavery. Wow. I was talking about an impression that I had at something I observed on Dorrance Street in the evening hours in Providence. I was on my way to a bus stop, and there were on the other side of the street, and I was happy it was the other side of the street, there was this guy who had a girlfriend in tow, and he was squeezing her hand and nearly dragging her on Dorrance Street towards the Kennedy Plaza, going towards Kennedy Plaza. And I said to myself, she doesn't seem to have much of a say in how fast she's walking, or the fact that she may be walking at all instead of just standing. She seems to be under the control of the individual. And I said to myself, if she doesn't see this now, is she going to have to see it later? I mean, the effects of it. If he'll be, come on, I'll take on the whole world right now, that doesn't exclude her when he wants to express his dominance.
And if that had happened, on their first date, if they were in an intimate partner relationship, then she probably would have said, this is going to be an unhealthy person for me. I don't want anything to do with them. But it probably escalated over time. Now you're in this situation, and it's not as easy as it might seem from the outside to get out. And also, like we hear people, well, why isn't she getting out of the situation? Why is that person being abusive, right? So flipping the script to say, why is that person behaving this way, and how can we hold them accountable? How can we disrupt that violence?
I'm sorry for that.
That's okay.
I can't do anything about it. I'm trying to, my phone doesn't work, so I can't easily turn it off.
One thing it makes me think of too, Ray, is being an active bystander, because in that situation, you have to assess your own safety, right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to say anything because who knows, someone might retaliate against me.
Yes.
So you always have to think of your safety first, but there are a few different things that you can do. If you're at a party and you see someone dragging someone, or see some sort of harassment happening, you can distract from the situation. You can spill your drink